All right, it's 3:30 on the dot. Welcome, everybody. We're going to travel back into time and think about what kelp is today. We are Kelp Culture, so it is a collaboration between Siobhan Braybrook at the Braybrook Laboratory and myself when I was a grad student at UCLA. And Jess is the manager in communications for the Kelp Culture group. We are a monthly speaker series that meets online to talk about all things marine ecology and kelp related from interdisciplinary backgrounds and perspectives. So we're always looking to hear from people that might have a really strong relationship to marine environments, but might not specifically study kelp, and just thinking about that basis in kelp and all that it supplies. So I'm Emma Nixon.
I'm Jess, Carstens-Kass.
And we're going to get started with our presentation now. So do you want to start us off with the first question, the big question in the room?
The first question is a question for everyone to think about in your minds. And that is, what does a long time mean to you? Close your eyes, ponder. Okay. And now I want to ask the same question to our panelists. So if each of you could introduce yourselves and say a quick something about what a long time means to you and how that relates to your research or your work, that would be great. Would you like to start?
Oh, I thought you'd never. Yeah, I know. I thought you'd never ask. So I'm Levi Simons with Kelp Arc and West LA College. And what is a long time? It depends on the context. If it's a movie I don't want to watch, it's 2 hours. If it's human civilization, it's 10,000 years. And if it's geologic time, half a billion is probably good enough.
Hello, I'm Gauwain Antell. I'm a professor in the geography department at UCLA. I am trained in paleontology. So my starting point for a long time would probably be if I'm having to use measurements of 100 million years. Here, each number here is a unit of 1 million years. Life starts about 500 million years ago. So maybe we agree that if we're starting to think about billions of years, that's a really long time ago. Extra qualifier there.
Yeah, I'm Dave Jacobs from UCLA, the EB department. I'm sort of a geologist and a biologist, so I can never make up my mind. And, there's lots of time scales of interest. The universe formed about 3 and change billion years ago. The Earth formed 4 and change billion years ago. Life has been on Earth for about a little less than 4 billion years or about that. So it all depends on your perspective. But a lot of things I think we want to think about with kelp, are on the orders of the last, tens of millions of years and perhaps the last tens of thousands of years. At least that's my perspective.
Hello, my name is Siobhan. I'm at UCLA, and our lab works on kelps and rockweeds sort of now, right? So we do some stuff with things that are living, and we've started working in things in the fossil record, which is why I'm here today. And so I guess like the longest time scale that I think about right now is not billions. I'm thinking like 10 million years ago. And at that time, the Los Angeles area where we are was all under the ocean. So it's thinking about the fact that where we stand now has over time really changed quite a lot, but still 10 million years is a pretty long time too. But it's nowhere close to like 4 billion years. That's bananas. But also, I was at the touch tank all morning. Jess and I were volunteering at the touch tank. And so this morning feels like a long time away. I'm tired. Woo! I'm tired. But yeah, I would say right now we think about sort of now, and then 10 million years is sort of the time horizon that I'm thinking of. Yeah, good?
You want to ask that?
Does anybody else have 10 million years as their long time? Just out of curiosity. No, nobody was like 10 million. Okay, I just thought I'd check.
Can I see like a little show of hands who had a number less than 100 years? Yeah, between 100 years and 1,000 years? All right, more than 1,000 years? Oh, that's a fair number of people. Yeah. And I'd say within like sort of people who are in, say, ecology departments and people who are maybe in geology departments, this separation kind of falls between thinking about units of thousands of years and thinking about units of millions of years. I think those are sort of, if I had to break down different ways of thinking about time, two pretty common camps.
Wait, so did anyone in the room actually think of millions? There was millions, right? Was there billions? Any further? Okay, billions. Oh, right on. Awesome. So I think that's a really good point that you make, Gauwain, because one of them is thinking about the human time scale and one of them is thinking about the geologic, right? So when you're thinking about a long time and you're going into the past, how does that help inform your research and how far back do you go? And that can be open to anybody.
Well, so this summer I was working with students on modeling where kelp's likely to grow in the future. And so I guess, but this is only on like decadal scales, but like we're looking at warming over like the next century. So we're dealing with these like human interactions with other stuff in the ecosystem. That seems like a reasonable amount of time. But if we were to start, I've also looked at other things like sort of deeper ecology, and like then it starts to look at like you're looking at interfaces between life and geologic cycles. And 100 years is like not even the blink of an eye. Like when we talk about things being quick, like in like geologic time, I mean, you're talking like let's say the Azola event when you had this like massive drawdown of CO2 about 50 million years ago. You know, when we talk about, oh, there was this quick drawdown of CO2, it's like 100,000 years, which is like, you know, more than all of human civilization. So it just depends on like what I want to like look at. If it's anything to do with people, like 100 years is totally fine. But when we start like looking at outside of that, yeah, then you start getting to millions of years.
Yeah, I think that's just it, is what time scale is relevant to you depends on what are the processes happening. Is it people making policy decisions and management decisions? That's really unpredictable on short scales of, you know, years, decades. But if we're thinking about how carbon cycles through our planet from the atmosphere to being stored in rock at the bottom of the ocean, then we're thinking on long time scales. And biology comes in across all different time scales because evolutionary processes can be happening on these scales where life is changing itself and life is changing the planet. So no matter what time scale you're thinking about, no matter how you define a long time, you can always bring life into play in that equation and study life on that scale. The challenging bit are that sometimes there's breakpoints where like we can study how life works at small scales, like years, and understand a population dynamic maybe on the scale of years, maybe decades. But humans only live so long. We don't really manage to track species continuously for like 1,000 years. Our longest running population monitoring doesn't go back, rarely more than 100 years. So we can get knowledge about what happens up to like a century scale. And then we can look at fossils. But fossils, we really can't look at anything happening on smaller scales than 1,000,000 years. So there's this interval between like 100 years and 1,000,000 years. That's a really big gap where we actually have very little data that we can figure out what does biology do, what processes are at work on that resolution.
Sure, I would jump in there and say, you may not be able to track an individual species that is your favorite species, like the stellar sea cow. Through that whole period of time back, you might only have intermittent fossilized sea cows. to look at in the Miocene or 10 million or 12,000 years ago or whatever. So you may have limits to your knowledge on that species or the sampling interval, but we do have detailed sampling of things that are continually deposited on Earth. And so we can say, hey, we have some understanding of climate cycles or phenomena that are going on during that period from, say, 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago to 1,000,000 years ago. We have lots of detailed knowledge, but it's narrow. And so then the question is, how do you extrapolate it to your favorite thing, like your sea cow or whatever it might be?
Can I just check, is the Steller sea cow your favorite animal?
I promised to say I didn't have a favorite animal before I came in here, but I guess that will have to do. In grad school, I was known as the manatee, so.
I think it's interesting because there was, what we know in terms of, I guess, our current scientific record of like what we know has been here for how long. And even that, so as a person who's mostly a seaweed person, we have herbarium records and we have scientific voyages that people did where they were writing down, what they've done. But even here, so on our coast of California, a lot of those records really only start getting rich sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so as far as like what we have as written records, right, there's all that time. So I'm looking at 10 million year old fossils, and then we jump to like a couple hundred years. But thinking about the fact that there is knowledge that's been put into stories, right, for people who have been on this coast a lot longer than that, but also that a lot of that gets lost. So a lot of traditional knowledge that we would have had here on this coast has been really challenging, I think, for people to maintain orally, especially through colonization events. So you think about not only what data one has access to just in terms of what your scientific instruments are, but how culturally and biologically, like we have ended up with gaps in our knowledge as well due to things that we have done as people to each other. That sort of makes sense. And I think it's really beautiful to see how some of things that have existed, for example, in like Indigenous stories, end up then coming back and being things that can be shown also with scientific evidence later. And so it's things that we consider to be stories are actually really just long-term record keeping of things that have happened on this coast for a long time. So, and it's important to honor that, I think, and also not use it, I would just say in a way. But I like to think about when, I guess maybe I'm more of an evolution person because I want to know how long have we had kelp? How long have we had the algae that we're here, at the kelp forest for? And I think, again, we do that. Like, how do we know how old kelp is? What do you think? What's the evidence that helps us know how old it is? You don't have to know the specific evidence, but like, probably not just because, well, I've been alive for 45 years, so I know there's been kelp for probably 45 years, right? But what other evidence do you think would help me know how old kelp is? Any guesses? Yes. Thanks, Dylan. Fossils, right? So we spoke about fossils, sort of telling us maybe things on a 1,000,000-year timescale, but we have so few kelp fossils. Like, and when I say so few, I mean there is one that is from the Los Angeles area, and then there's a collection of, I think, about 5 specimens now from Washington State, and those are the only kelp fossils that exist in the entire world. In the whole world. So you think about all the dinosaur fossils, all the Steller sea cow fossils, right? Like all of this, we have so few fossils for our kelp species around the world. And that tells us that, like, okay, we know that the rocks that those fossils are in are about 10 million years old for the ones from Los Angeles and maybe 35 million years old, the ones in Washington State. So we can say for sure that there was something that looked like kelp then. But we don't really know how far back it was either. Like it could have been. So the error bars on this for scientists in the room are huge. But I think it's kind of crazy to me that we have such, we're building really rich knowledge of what we have now, and we're thinking about what we have in the future, but we have such a dearth of knowledge in the past, I guess, which is not because they're not there. I think we just don't necessarily look for them, which is kind of, yeah, I'll stop ranting.
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, like, we could take a whole new conversational detour here about why that is, why there are so few kelp fossils relative to, say, dinosaurs. But I also realized that we have drifted away on the conversational currents from our starting question, which we perhaps never addressed. So if you'd like us to bring it back to whatever your original question was, we can revisit that.
I like the detours.
Kelp don't have bones.
They don't have.
Solid answer.
Yeah, so think about you're walking along on the beach. You could go out here and walk along the beach. What kinds of animal and plant remains are you going to find? You might find some, yeah.
Shells.
Shells! This is my moment. Okay, so I study the fossil record of shells because most of our fossil record is shells. It's not dinosaurs. How many dead pigeons do you see on the beach? Not very many. What's a pigeon? It's a bird. A bird is a kind of dinosaur. That's about representative of the fact that, you know, there's not as many pigeons as there are shells to begin with. Also, there's
Kelp don't have shells.
kelp don't have shells or bones. Also, the process of becoming a fossil, it's a very tricky thing. You can't just be torn apart or eaten as soon as you die. Think about the places where kelp live. If you were diving with the kelp, is that a nice, calm, peaceful place where the sediment is just going to slowly bury you? No, you're being battered all around, right? So if a piece of kelp breaks off, it dies, it's going to be broken and battered. It's not going to have a chance to settle on the seafloor and have other little bits of sand and debris slowly cover it, keep it from getting eaten, bury it very quickly before something else like an abalone comes and gobbles it up. That doesn't happen very often. The place where we get most of our like beautiful leaf fossils are lakes. Think about the nice shallow shore of a lake, very calm, a leaf falls on it, trickles down to the bottom. It's not getting bashed about by waves because there's not waves in your lake. And then maybe there's a rainstorm. And so the river that feeds into this lake brings a whole bunch of sand and mud because there's been all this water pummeling the land and bringing that into your river and then onto your lake, and it buries your leaf. And that's where we get all of these beautiful leaf fossils. We don't have that kind of process happening in our kelp forests.
Kelps live on rocks.
What?
Live on rocks.
They do live on.
Rocks are not good places to have sediments preserved.
Yeah, so to throw a wrench into this, or actually to continue that conversation, because so we something the audience should know is that we had a long Zoom call before this, and we sat together and we had a pre-panel. I'm sorry you couldn't join us. We didn't know you yet, but we're glad that you're here today. But in our pre-panel, we talked a lot about ecosystems, what they are, and how we distinguish whether or not they're healthy. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Jess in a second to ask a very important question that we have yet to answer, but is very central to this conversation. But the shells, like you mentioned something, was that kelp probably got eaten by the thing that had the shell. So in a way, could we study the fossil records and know from the number of shells that the kelp forest was healthy at that time? And what does it mean to study that specific species of kelp fossil versus the species that interacted with the kelp? So it might be the stellar cow or another type of mollusk, abalone, that do have records. But let's bring it back and think for a second about studying something that we have been, like, I put humans on this timeline just to show you guys how very small we are. And the kelp is really nice and big over there. So kelp has been around a lot longer than humans. And so as a human species trying to understand that, Jess has a question for us.
Yeah, what is kelp and when did it come to be?
You guys have opinions on what kelp is? Go for it.
I mean, it's one of the weirdest things I remember learning is they're most closely related to diatoms. So brown algae is kind of essentially multicellular diatoms. And I've seen estimates of like at least sort of what we would call kelp, maybe 50 million years. I've seen estimates like that. I mean, but that's like when we talk about methods, like this is like molecular clock data, like they kind of like, okay, we're going to estimate like based on mutation rates. So like that is what I would say. Like, I would say like roughly that's what I would put kelp as, is like, I mean, at least about that time frame. I mean, and
I
yeah.
don't disagree. Is that helpful? I'm like, that's about
Yeah, like I mean, and then like then you get this whole weird thing about like brown algae versus red versus green algae, and like basically it's this every one of these is like a new endosymbiotic event where like a new cell envelops another one, and you end up with this like matryoshka doll of like organelles and stuff.
So I don't want to assume what folks in the audience know either, right, about seaweeds in particular. But if you came by the touch tank and hung out with Jess and I earlier, we would have pointed out that generally we think of there being red seaweeds, green seaweeds, and brown seaweeds, right? And so those sort of red seaweeds and green seaweeds are more closely related to the plants that we have on land as well. And for a really long time, we thought that the brown seaweeds were also pretty closely related to plants. In fact, for most of time until around like the late 1990s and the 2000s, where people were like, wait, they're actually really different. Because when you look at kelp, which is a brown algae, like you look at the giant kelp on the screen, it looks a lot like a plant just growing in the ocean, right? So as human beings, we look at things and we're like, oh, that looks like a plant. It's probably related to plants. And now we know that actually that entire branch of the brown algae, which includes kelps, evolved completely separately from land plants and from red algae and from green algae, which I think is pretty random and amazing. And I love the world.
And that's why we like the browns.
Yeah, so our lab works more in the brown algae, no shade on the others, but it's because I'm interested in things that are so different from everything else. But this idea of like what a kelp is, I think is interesting too. So generally we think of kelps as being brown algae, but what falls into the definition of a kelp has changed over time too. So a lot of time people are just like, a kelp is anything big in the ocean that's photosynthesizing. So that's sort of more like an ecological type of functional definition. And now we tend to think, oh, okay, actually it's only this group of brown algae that are related to each other in what we call a phylogenetic order, the Laminarales. And so anything in there, we're like, that's a kelp. But different people use the term differently still. So you kind of have to be like, well, what do you mean by kelp? What do I mean by kelp? And what do you mean by kelp over there? But yeah, they're all brown algae. That part's easy now. But yeah, you want to go?
Yeah. Why don't we posit that we all agree what kelp is? Just right, yeah.
Conversation.
Yeah, so we can proceed. I think we're actually getting too worried about what kelp is in a phylogenetic or lineage sense, right? But I think what a lot of people are interested in is the ecological history of kelp, right? We're interested in what happened, how kelp and all their buddies got together. When did that happen? Maybe what made that happen? What required in the fullness of time, for that to occur? That would be one kind of other ecological thing to think about. And then we could also worry about, the fact that people have been here actually for a little while. They've been here for at least, well, there's dramatic ecological events about 13,300 years ago where people really started burning down California. And so you can sort of get to the point that there are a lot of people here, and the archaeological record is pretty rich referent to this problem because people were on the coast. And people were on the coast in part because maybe they came here on the coast in what's called the Kelp Highway. So there's a number of things that might be fun to talk about that have to do with those sort of events in ecological history or what have you, which are at various time scales. And so maybe we should
Decide on what kelp is for our
yeah,
conversation.
just or just agree to disagree or whatever it is. Kelp are big photosynthetic thingies in the ocean. That we see in reefs in California, and they're mostly brown. And I'm sorry.
No, let's do it. Big photosynthetic brown algae. I could do that.
That attach to rocks. And
I mean,
so can I go back to this 50 million years? I heard that number a couple times. Is that a okay-ish number-ish?
Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Can
Our oldest fossil for these big giant brown algae in the ocean is around 35 million years ago from the rocks, 35 million years old. So with some like giant error bars on that, 50 million sounds about right.
Could I have us do a tiny little activity to put that number in context? If you had to know a number from geologic history, probably one of the most common ones is, when was the big asteroid that smashed in and killed all of the dinosaurs except for birds? 65 million years ago. So we're talking about maybe half the time since the age of dinosaurs ended, or soonish after that age ended. And if we think about the entire history of animal life, since we had stuff that we could recognize belonging to some of the groups that we have alive today, I'm going to invite you, if you're able, to stand and think about, you are the time scale. Your body is the time scale. The floor is the very beginning of animal life. Where would you put on your body that line of end of the dinosaurs? Is that like at your belly button? Is that like at your shoulders? Your toes are when life started.
My head is now.
The hair growing on your head is like humans.
When did all
Like this, your hair scalp follicles. Yeah, you are
like you're talking like just life at all, or both sides.
I'm talking about Cambrian explosion.
Oh, Cambrian.
Yeah, animal phyla.
Yeah.
Yeah, you look fantastic. We're talking about like right in our eyebrows. You can sit down now. So there's a whole lot of time before then, even when we think about like age of the dinosaurs, big, deep time. This time scale here, we did give you the answer behind us, is the time scale of recognizable animal groups. That Cenozoic, that is at 65 million years ago. The start of the Cenozoic is the end of the age of dinosaurs. And you can see where 50 is on the scale bar relative to that. So we're talking about a very long time ago, 50 million years ago, but we're also talking about that as not a long time relative to some other histories.
Thank you. Something we've talked about a little bit before is whether the things that we're calling kelp that existed 35, 50 million years ago are the same things that we call kelp today. Because evolution happens and things look different over time. So I'm wondering if any of you have something to say about that. Are they still kelps? Should we call them something different?
I think that would be confusing. So for instance, Siobhan is studying fossil kelp that are about 10 million years old and change, and they look a lot like a modern genus of kelp, and are assigned to that group, give or take. I don't remember
Are
the
they?
details of the taxonomy.
Stick paleo in the front.
Yeah. So it is 10. It is. Whatever.
Fossil, which we haven't. We'd probably just call it paleomacrosystem, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm agreeing. I don't think we need more words. I think we got plenty of technical words already in spades.
It was, I mean, they were probably also just big photosynthetic things in the ocean. It's kelp enough we could call it kelp. Yeah.
Kelp enough.
Kelp enough. It looks like it. We can't get DNA out of kelp fossils. Unfortunately, that's not really how kelp fossils work, right? They don't fossilize as nicely as apparently mosquitoes in amber if this was Jurassic Park. If this was Cenozoic Park, I couldn't pull some DNA out of my seaweed fossils. They can probably still hear me. I'm loud. Oh, but maybe not the recording.
I wish I could pull some like DNA out of the Cenozoic fossils we have and then like recreate dinosaur algae. We can't do that. We can't get DNA out of them at all. So in fact, what we see is just sort of impressions and stains on rocks. So we're just going by the shape of them. And then it's really startling at how the shape is really similar to what we can find today. And it's always possible that could be some other branch of life that ended up extinct that we no longer have. But the simplest explanation would be that that's just an ancestor of the things we have now. And actually, they're just pretty damn good at what they do. And so they haven't needed to change their bodies very much. And because I think they're amazing organisms, I think that's maybe more likely to be true. But evidence, scientific evidence comes up all the time, and maybe we'll change our minds. So.
And the same could be said of the mosquitoes in the Dominican amber. We still call them mosquitoes. They aren't the same mosquitoes species that we have today. But when we find them, we can recognize them as like, yeah, that's mosquito. We don't have some other word for them as like proto-mosquitoes. We just call them mosquitoes of a certain age. Another random fun fact for you to go tell people your trivia knowledge now about Jurassic Park. In Jurassic Park, the amber that they took that had the DNA is from the Dominican Republic. You know how old the amber is in the Dominican Republic? It's from the Miocene. It's the same age as these kelp fossils, which is half as old as the end of the age of the dinosaurs. So there's no way that even if a mosquito in that amber had gone and sucked blood of stuff and retained the DNA, it would not tell us about T-Rex, unfortunately. Just that one minor quibble with the science of Jurassic Park, if I may.
So actually, just to burst everyone's bubble, so I've actually worked with the oldest sequenceable DNA that we've ever gotten from environmental samples, and it's only 4 million years old.
What is it?
There's some like Arctic sediment samples that were collected in northern Canada. So as long as like the DNA is like, not exposed to oxygen and light and it's cold, we've been able to get stuff like now the fragments are really degraded, but they're sequenceable up to about 4 million years old. That's like the oldest. So like we can get fossilized proteins going back tens of millions of years. And there's even some really crazy stuff where you can get fossilized biomolecules going back over 600 million years old. And the reason why that's of any interest is because only animals, as far as we know, produce cholesterol, and there are fossils that are before the Cambrian from this wonderful era known as the Ediacaran, where you have very enigmatic fossils. It was basically God's beta test, that like basically stuff that looks completely insane compared to what it is today. And there has been a lot of debate, like, were these even animals or something totally different? And someone was actually able to extract fossilized cholesterol out of 600 million year rock and show like, yeah, these were probably animals. Now, figuring out where we would ever place these things in like the phylogenetic tree is like maybe close to a lost cause, but at least we can say they're animals. So
to put this back on our graphic behind us, we're talking about the far left end here. The very oldest thing on this time scale is where we're talking about having recognizable cholesterol that we can pick chemically from rock. But back to your some preserved DNA from these really cold places. That's also why people talk about, you know, potentially bringing back the woolly mammoth or the saber-toothed tiger or the dire wolf, because those lived in these places that are totally iced over. So we can go, say, to the Siberian steppe and pull out a whole frozen mammoth that's still got its fur and such, because it's just like a little mammoth popsicle. We wouldn't have such good luck reconstructing, for instance, the American lion, which lived here in the ice ages, because we weren't covered in ice here in Southern California in the ice ages. So we don't have any lion frozen in a block of ice. So we can't extract that DNA. There's no way it preserved.
But what about kelp?
I'm going to bring us back to kelp. Yes. Yes, David. So I fear that we are missing the forest for the tree, quite literally. So let's talk about the kelp forest. So kind of it sounds like we settled on is that kelp actually looks a lot like the paleo kelp, the kelp that we have today, the macrocystis that we have today. Like if you were to look at a kelp forest, okay, maybe disputable. But if you can picture it, the kelp forest might have functioned similarly ecosystemically. So maybe it was serving a certain purpose, and maybe there were certain predators that were replaced by others. So we used to have sea otters along the coast. We also used to have stellar sea cows that looked a lot like manatees that are now extinct. So if you were looking at the kelp forest back in time, you would see different species altogether. You would see different at different levels of that ecosystem, you would see different predators. And so if you looked at the forest as a whole, rather than the single individual information that we have been able to get from it as a fossil record. That would look very different at that time. And so I guess my question for you guys is, because today we're here at the California Seaweed Festival, and if some of you guys went to the earlier presentations, a lot of the way of thinking about kelp and restoration in the future, it maps two things pretty closely: quantity of kelp and diversity, right? So we're looking at quantity and we're looking at diversity, and to what baseline are we looking at that? So are we comparing it to a kelp forest that had stellar sea cows, or we try to bring back the stellar sea cows and bring back this really prehistoric kind of kelp forest? Siobhan wants it. She thinks that this is, no, I'm just kidding.
I think it's important. When do
so
you restore back
yes, so,
the age?
and we're going really far back to try to home this back into perspective here. So I'd love to hear from you guys.
Ecologically, if we think of a kelp forest, and we think of basically California, the ocean here is the most diverse, temperate shoreline in the world. And so we then have a question: why is this the most diverse, temperate shoreline in the world? And the answer appears to be because there was lots of upwelling starting at a particular point in time that is not that far back. It's a little, maybe about the time of Siobhan's fossil, maybe 10 or 12 million years ago. And at that time, you wound up with a transition. It's in the Cenozoic. It's actually in the Miocene, to, again, a repeated cooling of Antarctica. And that actually made the waters cold below. And so when you upwelled water, you got cold water up that reinforced the upwell and climatologic. And the consequence of that is that all of a sudden you have upwelling systems. And if you look at molecular chronologies of all the groups of things that are diverse here, like let's take rockfish. There's boatloads of rockfish. Yeah, they all evolved. Oops, they all evolved. They all evolved. At this time in late Miocene, so you turned this whole ecology on, including the diversification of kelp around the world at that time, if that makes sense. Sorry if you didn't hear what I was saying to begin with. So that's an interesting starting point to say, hey, this ecology that we have here has an origin in geological processes, in certain events in the past. And so that's one thing we can think about, is that's when the ecology we have today and most of the biodiversity we have today got going. That's why we have so many rockfishes, 100 species or more here on the coast, et cetera. They've evolved at that point in time. So we can begin to unpack some of these details, not just in the lineage of kelp, but in terms of ecology of the whole system and what may be going. And there's lots of things to say about it.
Yeah, so this takes us back to our initial points about sort of how we think about biology relating to what's happening on a planetary scale. Dave's just been referring to some events that happened on a planetary scale. In particular, Antarctica used to be connected on one side to Australia and on the other side to South America. So it didn't used to be one isolated blob at the bottom of the globe. Eventually, those other continents drifted away. It became its own isolated thing, and then the water can move all the way around it. This is called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. It's the strongest current on Earth today, moves with the force of 100 Amazon rivers, and it's keeping Antarctica frozen. It's keeping all the cold there. And this had influence for the entire rest of the world's oceans, because the water in one ocean moves through all of the other oceans in one big conveyor belt. So we had huge changes here because of what happened in Antarctica when that one switch flipped. And now we've had our ocean system like it is today continuously since that point in time. So there was this geological trigger that set up the modern ocean, modern here, meaning going back through the Miocene.
Yeah, for the last 35 million years, we've been in an ice age. Because once Antarctica broke away, like, it could just stay permanently cold. You got these large permanent ice caps. And so, which is kind of weird to think about, even after we're going to go through massive amounts of global warming, we will still technically be in an ice age because we have permanent ice caps. There have been plenty of times in Earth's history, like on this, where we've had much larger extensive ice. We've also had times with no ice caps whatsoever. So like the kelp seemed to have something seemed to have really kicked off maybe about 35 million years ago.
Yeah. So so this is all, we can see that it would be hard to have kelps and kelp forests in these time periods that are just being described, which are greenhouse time scale, where the whole world is warm. And so you don't have cold water. It seems that having a source of cold water, at least below, et cetera, that can intermittently and perhaps during various periods of time in the Cenozoic make these ecological situations that can support kelp. That's probably not going on when you get back to the Jurassic or the Cretaceous or the Triassic, which is basically times of really a bathwater ocean. If you go, those are times when there are cycads growing near the North Pole, et cetera. And so it's a very different world and probably a kelp-free world, or we can at least guess that it's a kelp-free world. But then there are these episodes in the Cenozoic where we have cold water and the evolution of kelp in kelp ecology.
So just to bring us back to this 50 million year number again, that is actually, this 50 million years ago, is the point of this really, really hot Earth that we're hearing about. We have palm tree frond fossils in Antarctica. Yeah, like a big old palm leaf flat on a rock that we find in Antarctica. We find alligators in Wyoming. That's how hot Earth was. So Earth has actually been much hotter than it is today, but the rate of warming that we're having today is unprecedented. We have never had Earth warm as quickly. In fact, right now it's warming about 10 times faster than any sort of historical precedent that we think. But Earth has itself, on average, been much hotter. And that's at this 50 million year number. And then temperatures started to get cooler after that. But we've definitely drifted away now from this idea of like, what should we be restoring back to?
I think
I'm happy to keep talking on that as well.
Yeah, I think that this brings us right to what I did want to talk about, which is that a lot of the restoration projects that we're working on have to do with our response to climate change and what we're doing to the kelp forest as humans. And so what I wonder a lot about is how looking into kelp's deep past can inform our current and future kelp goals.
Okay, so this gets in this really broad question about what restoration, like you can never go. Okay, so my opinion is you can never go back. You can just make where you are manageable. So like, what is your goal with an ecosystem? And to me, it's just like you want to try to like have something that be resilient and functional. How you get there, I don't know if it really matters too much. I don't really believe in like single species conservation for that reason. Things are constantly changing. You're constantly having these extinction events, but you can try to make things as resilient and as functional as possible. And how that may look in 500 years is going to just be different. Like the planet's going to get warmer, so how do you make the most of it, I guess? And I don't think we know yet. These are just systems that are too complicated yet for us to really get a good handle.
I think it's important to understand one thing is that I think it seems important to understand, the chronology of human impact. And so, when we start talking about the Steller sea cow, there used to be Steller sea cows, there's at least one dredged up off of California. So back in the day, there used to be sea cows in our kelp forests, but they were long gone before Western folks showed up because they're actually probably the best thing to eat here. And so people came to these shores on something called the Kelp Highway, something about 14 or 15,000 years ago, probably on shores that were rockier and had much more kelp than we have today. And they found this attractive. And that's largely why the Americas were peopled, or it's a very significant factor in the peopling of Americas. And, those folks had impacts on the ecology. They not only ate, excuse me?
Could you briefly describe the Kelp Highway hypothesis for those who don't know that?
I can try. Yeah, so during the time when there was the most ice on Earth, say around in these glacial cycles, the last time there was lots of ice on Earth, it was kind of hard to get to North America. And this was about 20,000 years ago or so. And so folks from Asia some of them may have made it over before that ice age and have been wandering around somewhere. But the majority of people seem to have come along the Pacific coast after the glaciers retreated, which enough so you could chop a log in half, sit on it, and paddle down the coast with you and a couple of your in-laws. And so you could get to the next place and find the next large mammals that were on the coast, like sea cows or maybe elephant seals. Those could feed your group pretty well. But then there are also all these other things you could eat. Nobody had been there to eat any of the mussels or the clams or the abalone before this time, because there'd been no ecologically significant number of people on the coast. Maybe there'd be a few people wandering around at some point. But all of a sudden you have a lot of people, probably a lot of partially hewed out logs were floating down the coast, and people were eager to get to the next place because every place you went would have lots and lots of food on the shore and also food inland. And so this is why people all of a sudden were going down this shore and getting perhaps waylaid from time to time and going inland, different populations. And so this is how the Americas seem to have been populated. And there are, the first, there's, some folks that there's a, skeleton in the Northern Channel Islands. It's about 12,000 years old. And if you look at the Northern Channel Islands and even these large islands off of the middle of Baja, California, they've had archaeological records for over 11,000 years. So these are the records of people actually eating things like abalone and mussels and so forth. So they've been piling up data for us that are somewhat relevant to kelp, indirectly perhaps, but we can say, hey, are these things that are trophically important to maintain kelp there? Are there things like sheephead or otters or what have you?
Yeah, exactly. So adding to that point, so for those of you that don't know, the Northern Channel Islands are the ancestral land of the Chumash, and they lived there for thousands of years. And there's an archaeologist, and who David is referencing, Erlandson, who was looking at the shell middens with the abalone collections on the islands to look at how the quantity of certain species and how that could predict, what the state of the kelp forest was at that time. And the kelp highway hypothesis is one theory in several creation story theories for the Chumash on the island. But yeah, bringing this back in, I think this is a really good point to talk about, is that looking at the other species does give you this window into looking at the health of the ecosystem. And I really like what Levi was saying, which is like, I don't know, but like right now in this moment, we're changing this scale. We're changing actually this geological scale. For us being a very small point on this timeline, we are changing it at a geological scale. And so I think trying to figure out, like, as researchers and as a community, what we value in restoration is super important. And that's the work Levi and I were doing over the summer. We have some of the wonderful West LA College interns in the crowd. But looking, and for us, having this talk is really like putting things into perspective for me, because we were looking at the time scale of 100 years into the future. And when we were doing that, I was thinking, wow, that seems like a really long time from now. I can't even imagine the next 3 years going by fast. So I'm glad you just got that. So yeah, I'm pointing at Levi because we've had these conversations in the internship, but yeah, a geologic scale. I mean, that is a huge thing. And so trying to figure out, like, is it, like, what do we value? Is it biodiversity in the ecosystem and the things you guys have studied? Like, is it the quantity of a certain species? Like, I guess in your research and your work and the way that you've reflected backwards, now kind of thinking into the future, or thinking into the present moment, with everything that you guys know, because you have this depth of knowledge, how do you move, like, what gives you hope, and how do you want to move forward with your research, and what questions do you want to ask?
Can I go?
So when we talk about the fact that the rate of change of climate now is faster than it has been, right, because of our impact on the environment, then what I try and think about is like, okay, so because I believe in human climate change, just to be clear. This is being recorded. That's fine. I believe in science, and I believe that's what science shows us, but that I also think that there's a huge amount of, so we've done a lot of things to our planet, but we're also really, really incredible and smart and innovative. And like all of the things that you've been hearing today that people have been talking about restoration, and like all of the science that we have, and all of, you know, the young folks I'm seeing in the audience as well. It's like we have the brains and the aptitude to be able to find ways that we can leverage science to help biology, I think, evolve faster than it might if it was just left on its own. And I think we have to be kind of careful with that. Like, I'm not trying to tell you we should be making Franken seaweed. But at the same time, it's like there is a certain clock within which we have changes in DNA that happens. And what does it look like if we have change in the environment that's going faster than how things, see, they're excited about Franken kelp. Not really. Is there a way that we can help speed up the evolution of some of these organisms so that they're able to survive? And what would that look like? And I think that's the type of thing that we could be thinking about as scientists. So can we help things cope with a faster rate of change than they're evolutionarily used to? Can we do that in a wide swath of things, not just giant kelp or Nereocystis, which a lot of people are spending a lot of time thinking about, but what about all of the other kelps and all of the other algae and all of the other animals that depend on all of these different kelps, right? So again, this ecosystem perspective. And I don't want to sit there and just say, oh, well, let's just see what happens, because that's one thing we could do. You know, nature will take its course. I'd rather we use the sort of, you know, brilliance that we've been building as human beings to try and now use that to make a positive difference, to correct some of the things that were done in the past by our ancestors to try and make a better future. But yeah, that's my dream. Let's see. I think science can do amazing things. So I hope we'll be able to do it together.
I've been sitting here thinking about how to synthesize all this. First of all, I just want to go back to seashells. We have seashells as a source of evidence. It's one of our only sources of evidence. And you just answered your own earlier question, right? Of saying, oh, we can look at these seashells to try and infer something about the ecosystems where the shells were living, something about the plant communities based on the shells. Those shells are also telling us something about the human populations that were there, because those shells are there in the middens through human activity. So through the seashells, we can learn about all sorts of aspects of the human and marine system. Seashells are fantastic. That's my aside. But I want to go back to this. We've heard of like, how do we look at the past and the future? I really like this goal for conservation being, how do we make something functional and resilient and stable, sustainable? To me, that gets us thinking about something concrete without getting bogged down into things about like, okay, we want to restore it to how it used to be in the 50s, how it used to be in 1900, how it used to be in 1850 when we have our first records. By 1850, we already had extensive cattle ranching in this area, and that completely changed the seafloor. By the time we have our first written records of the ecology here, human colonial people here had already completely transformed the ecology. So those first records of here's what the pristine ecosystem is, were already different from what that ecosystem looked like even a few decades before. So should that be our baseline? Should we be restoring to 2,000 years ago? We have permanently lost some of the species that were key species 2,000 years ago. So I feel like that is unhelpful to try and define a point we're trying to get back to, because there's no obvious point that we can all agree on is the right point. So thinking about how do we make something functional going forward, to me, feels more actionable. What I find the value in doing and looking backwards is, say, we just heard about the Kelp Highway hypothesis and how abundant this place was. And for me, that's one of the beautiful things about looking to the past, is it gives us this ability to imagine abundance. And I think that's something we often lack today, is we look to the future and we feel fear, and we can only imagine something as like little patches of something diverse. We can imagine maybe we hope that everyone will have enough, But what if we imagined not only that everybody had enough, but what if we imagined everyone had abundance? So they wanted to go to places because there was so much that was there.
Well, it'd be nice if everything were abundant, but one of the things that we can realize is there's aspects of diversity that are important. People have emphasized in ecology of kelp that trophic variation is important, that having lots of different things around to eat the urchins, for instance, makes things more stable. And so a lot of human activities have been eliminating those entities that make kelp forests more stable. That is, they're the fish or the otters. I mean, otters were largely eliminated from California by about the 1820s. They were all sold to the Chinese, and so it was it was a very different world. But still, these changes have occurred in the past. Multiple changes have occurred in the past, and there are dramatic changes also that Native Americans make. So we shouldn't just hog all that impact onto Westerners. I mean, so I think that everybody has impacted the world, and we should realize that and go and think about all the trophic impacts and see, well, maybe we can learn something so we can recomplicate or re-diversify and sustain kelp in that way.
Yeah, I think it largely comes back to cohabitation and living with other species on the planet. And so, like what Siobhan was saying, like we could help aid in kelp as a species, and we can, like Levi was saying, help it be as resilient as it can be in the small communities that we can work with and work together on. And it's really about, working as small units and groups and not just like letting things be as they are. And so I'm taking a lot out of this panel, and I hope you guys are as well, and that this has intrigued a lot of questions for you guys. We have about 4 minutes left. This flew by from the perspective up here, but I want to throw this out to the audience in case you guys have questions for the panelists before we have to wrap up today. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand.
We're talking about when did kelp come to be. I'm wondering if maybe you as a group or one of you in particular can give us a broad crash course on how is the kelp phylogeny made, what data goes into that, how do we know where the branches are, how far back they go. I'd just love to learn more about that.
I mean, okay, so the short answer is, so you look at all the genetic diversity and you kind of like you just start with literally grouping like, oh, these genomes of these two species, they look really similar. So we're going to assume like they're like, different species of the same genus or something. So you're going to put those branches close to each other. And you kind of keep arranging things like, oh, okay, the more similar genetically they are, the closer you put them together. And you start trying to assemble trees that way. And then you make assumptions, and this is a big thing. You make an assumption on genetic mutation rates, and you assume they're relatively constant. Big assumption. And then you look at like how different they are genetically, how many base pairs they are, and you go like, okay, like I assume like 1,000 base pair changes like every million years, and you try to extrapolate back like where do things converge. That's basically that's done now. There's like a lot of like error and uncertainty with these like molecular clock studies because some things can like look, you can try to make predictions look way older or way younger than they are compared to like what you might see with fossil evidence. Because again, the big assumption is constant mutation rate. And we make that because like if you don't make that assumption, then it becomes basically impossible, but it's at least like a hand wavy way to get at it. Oh.
And all that DNA that we're using is for the things that we have now around the world, right? So we just have the DNA from the living things now, and we try and use mathematical models to sort of look at this relatedness over time. And so the star there for brown algae above the Ordovician, like around 450-ish million years ago, that's the most recent estimate based on these mathematical calculations from a paper that came out last year. And before that, there was a paper, I think that was 2020, that had the origin actually a lot later in time. And so this is shifting all the time because our math changes, our methods change, and people do things like they'll say, well, let's have different mutation rates and see what happens. So this is a hypothesis. The only real things we can anchor in time are when we have fossils. And there are so very few of them for brown algae and for kelps. But that does help you, like, so they'll put these into these phylogenies as well over time, and they'll be like, look, we know we had something that looked like elk kelp, pelagophycus, 10 million years ago. And so it allows you to constrain one of those relationships, at least within that range of time. So you get these few anchor points that help kind of spread things out, but the rest of it, woof, that's just magic math. And it could be wrong, right? We get new evidence that changes that thing. That help? I mean, I think the molecular stuff could be wrong, like the estimates of mutation rate. Yeah, not the fossils. It's hard for those to be wrong. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. I think you had your hand up first. Yeah.
So I have a fossil related question. I know we're in California, obviously we're on the West Coast, but there are kelps around the world. Do you have any hypotheses, or do you know if there are people looking for fossils in other places where there may be better conditions for kelps to have fossilized in the past before? Like, I don't know, maybe brackish water, like on the East Coast or something, like kelps found it easier to, they don't find things, but maybe it was better conditions for fossils to form, like at different points in history, like, yeah.
The question is whether we have, if there's so few fossils, especially for kelps, can we go out and like look now, like in different areas around the world, right? Because we know they're spread around the world now. The answer is I don't think anyone is actually currently doing that at all. It's a really, really small field that may just be me and my student. And part of that is because it's difficult for them to fossilize, it's difficult for them to preserve, but also we haven't known when to look necessarily, right? But so the newest estimate, the newest sort of time calibrated phylogeny we have says, well, maybe we should be looking in this like early Cenozoic, late Cretaceous period. And so now what we can do is we can say, okay, where around the world do we have good marine fossil collections that have come? And then it's just, part of it is you could go there, and part of it is you can go and look in collections that people have already done in museums, which is a fun thing that we're going to try and start doing, is like, let's go see. Because a lot of times what happens, unsurprisingly, is there'll be fish people who will be looking for fish fossils, or plant people looking for plant fossils. And they'll be like, well, this is neither of those. This is not animal nor plant. It must be an algae. And then they stick it in a box on a shelf at the back of a museum. So I think there's a lot more data out there, even though it is hard to do. And so, but the current science gives us a way to look for those time periods. And there's a lot of work to do if anybody wants to come check it out. There's a lot of space. It's not super crowded. And it's a really cool question. Obviously, you're kelpaholics, so.
I think we have to wrap it up, but I hope all of you enjoyed this as much as I did. It was amazing to have the opportunity at this festival to have an in-person kelp culture talk, but I want to remind all of you that we have roughly monthly virtual seminar series, and there's a QR code on our slide that you can scan to become a kelp culture member and RSVP for our next talk on October 23rd. And please help me to thank our panelists today.
And enjoy the rest of your time at the Seaweed Festival.